Right now you could walk into a store and buy a chocolate bar for less than the price of a coffee. You'd probably grab it without thinking, toss it on the counter, and forget about it by the time you got to your car. But here's what nobody tells you about that moment. The thing you just bought without blinking was once so valuable that empires were built around it. People didn't eat it. They counted it. They stored it in treasuries. They went to war over it. And not just valuable for its time valuable. We're talking more practically useful than gold. Gold at time couldn't feed you, couldn't heal you, couldn't be handed to a street vendor in exchange for a meal. But cacao could do all of that, and it did every single day in one of the largest and most sophisticated civilizations the world had ever seen. Yeah, that valuable. Here's the thing though, this isn't just a story about an ancient snack getting a glow up. What actually happened is far stranger than that. There's a century-long cover-up. There's a religious scandal. There's slavery, corporate monopolies, and a twist ending that involves the entire thing possibly disappearing within your lifetime. Once you see the full picture, that chocolate bar at the checkout counter is never going to feel the same again. Before we go any further, let me tell you what we're doing here, because this story goes back a lot further than most people realize, and it answers a question that sounds impossible until you see the evidence. Why was chocolate once more expensive than gold? Not in some loose poetic sense, in a very literal, documented, economic sense. There was a time when cacao beans held more practical value than the gold sitting in the same treasury. Kings hoarded them, warriors were paid in them, entire empires rose and fell based on who controlled the supply. The answer to that question isn't a single fact or a fun trivia point. It's a 5,000-year story that stretches from the first civilizations in the Americas, to the courts of Europe, to the factory floors of the Industrial Revolution, and it ends somewhere you probably won't expect. We're going to trace that story from the very beginning, from the first moment a human being cracked open a cacao pod in a jungle and realized something extraordinary was inside, through the civilizations that turned it into currency and sacred ritual, through the conquest that stole it, through the century it was kept as a state secret, through the slavery that produced it, through the machines that democratized it, all the way to the $130 billion industry it is today. Every chapter of that journey answers a piece of the question in the title, and some of those answers are genuinely dark. Somewhere between 40 and 50 million people around the world currently depend on cacao farming for their survival. The industry their labor feeds generates over $130 billion a year. The distance between those two numbers is where most of this story lives. And it's a distance that has existed, in one form or another, since the very beginning. So let's go to that beginning 5,000 years back, a dense, humid jungle in what's now Ecuador, a tree that nobody outside of that jungle had ever seen, and a discovery that would quietly reshape the course of human civilization. The real beginning, not the European version, not the factory version, not the Willy Wonka version, the actual original moment when humans first encountered this plant. And when I say the beginning, I mean further back than most people realize. If you've ever looked this up, you've probably seen the number 4,000 years thrown around. ancient Mesoamerica, the Maya, the Aztecs, that kind of thing. Reasonable enough. Except it's wrong, or at least it's incomplete. In 2018, a team of researchers published a study in Nature Ecology and Evolution that pushed the timeline back dramatically. They analysed residue found on ancient ceramic vessels from the Mayo Chinchipe culture, a civilization that lived in what's now Ecuador in the upper Amazon basin. The residue contained chemical signatures of cacao. The vessels were dated to roughly 5,300 years ago. 5,300 years. That's over 1,000 years earlier than the oldest previously confirmed evidence. Before the Maya, before the Aztec Empire even existed as a concept. Before most of the civilizations we associate with chocolate had even begun to form. Somewhere in that jungle, more than 5 millennia ago, someone cracked open a strange-looking pod from an unremarkable understory tree and found something inside worth paying attention to. The pulp around the seeds was sweet enough to eat. The seeds themselves were bitter, almost unpleasantly so. But when you processed them, dried them, ground them down, something changed. Something happened. That was hard to describe, but impossible to ignore. That tree would eventually get a scientific name, Theobroma cacao. The name was given by Carl Linnaeus in 1753, the same guy who basically invented the modern system for naming living things. And the name he chose translates from the Greek to food of the gods. That wasn't Linnaeus being poetic. He was echoing something that cultures across Mesoamerica had understood, independently and consistently, for thousands of years before he ever held a cacao pod. This plant was sacred, not valuable sacred, not we really like this sacred. Sacred in the way that altered how you understood the world, how you spoke to the divine, and what you buried with your dead. The first civilization we can clearly link to deliberate cacao cultivation is the Olmec, a culture that thrived along the Gulf Coast of Mexico from roughly 1500 to 400 BC. They're sometimes called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, and for good reason. A lot of what later civilizations built, their calendars, their art, their ball games, their gods, traces back to Olmec foundations. The word cacao itself may come from an Olmec language, though the linguistic trail gets murky that far back. What we do know is that the Olmec were processing and consuming cacao in ways that look deliberate, ritualized, and deeply embedded in daily life. But it was the Maya who took it to another level entirely. For the Maya, cacao wasn't just a crop. It wasn't even just a luxury. It was woven into the fabric of their cosmology, their understanding of creation itself. In the Popol Vuh, the sacred creation text of the Quiché Maya, cacao appears as one of the divine foods discovered in the underworld. The gods themselves are depicted holding cacao pods. In the Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving Maya manuscripts. When Maya kings died, jars of prepared cacao were placed in their tombs, because wherever you were going next, you were going to need it there too. That's not a food. That's a passport to the afterlife. Now here's the part that really throws people. What the Maya were actually drinking bore almost no resemblance to anything you'd recognize as chocolate today. Picture this: a royal court, probably around 600 AD. A ceremony is underway. A high priest approaches a carved stone vessel and lifts it above his head. Inside is a thick, dark liquid, closer to red than brown, coloured with achiote, which gave it the appearance of blood. Mixed into it, ground cacao, water, chili pepper, vanilla, and sometimes cornmeal for body. No sugar, none. The priest pours the liquid from that vessel into a second one on the ground, slowly from height, then back again, then again, over and over, until the surface of the drink is covered in a thick, dark, almost velvety foam. That foam was the point. Among the Maya, the froth on top of a cacao drink was considered the most sacred part, the most prized part, the part you offered to a god, not to a guest. Getting it right required skill, patience, and vessels specifically designed for the pouring technique. Maya pottery paintings actually depict this exact process. Women and priests pouring chocolate from height, the foam cascading between containers. If someone handed you this drink today, you probably wouldn't like it. It was bitter, spicy, thick, and unfamiliar. Nothing like the sweet, smooth, milky flavour we've been trained to associate with the word chocolate. What the Maya drank and what you buy at a store are technically made from the same plant, but the similarity basically ends there. One thing would have translated across those 5,000 years, though: the feeling. Cacao contains a compound called theobromine, the primary psychoactive substance in the plant. It's a methylxanthine, chemically related to caffeine, but different in important ways. Where caffeine hits fast and fades fast, theobromine works slower. The effect is gentler, warmer, longer lasting. A sustained lift in mood and alertness that feels less like a jolt and more like a quiet expansion of focus. The Maya had no word for theobromine, no framework for understanding alkaloid chemistry, but they absolutely felt it. Every single time they drank cacao, something happened that went beyond taste. A shift in clarity, a heightened sense of presence. When a priest drank it before a ritual, the ritual felt different. When a warrior drank it before battle, the battle felt different. Over centuries, that consistent, reproducible effect fused with the mythology until the two became inseparable. Cacao wasn't just associated with the gods, it felt like the gods were in it. Which, honestly, is not a bad intuition. Linnaeus would have agreed. The important thing here is who got access to this experience and who didn't. Cacao in Maya society was not for everyone. It was reserved for royalty, for priests, for warriors, and for the merchant class who controlled its trade. Ordinary people in a Maya city probably knew what cacao was, probably understood its significance, but they weren't drinking it. The word cacao carried weight. Saying it meant something, hearing it meant someone important was nearby, or something important was about to happen. This wasn't a treat. It was a marker of status, spiritual authority, and political power, all compressed into a single bitter cup, topped with sacred foam. For over 1,000 years, the Maya refined this relationship with cacao. They cultivated it, traded it, ritualized it, buried it with their kings, painted it into their sacred books, and built a culture around it that treated a jungle tree as a bridge between the human world and the divine. But then a civilization rose to the north, larger, more militarized, more economically ambitious than anything Mesoamerica had seen before. They encountered the Maya's sacred drink, recognized its power immediately, and decided that reverence alone wasn't enough. They were going to turn it into a system. The Maya treated cacao as something sacred, a bridge between humans and gods, poured carefully in royal courts, and buried alongside kings. For over 1,000 years, that relationship held, reverent, ritualized, almost quiet in its devotion. The Aztecs were not quiet about anything. The empire that rose to dominance in central Mexico, starting around the 14th century, didn't just adopt cacao from the Mesoamerican cultures it conquered. It absorbed cacao, amplified it, scaled it up, and turned it into the backbone of the most sophisticated economic system in the Western Hemisphere. Where the Maya saw a sacred plant, the Aztecs saw all of that, and a currency, a military asset, a political tool, and a status symbol so extreme it bordered on performance art. Everything about Aztec chocolate was bigger, louder, and more obsessive than what came before. Start with the mythology, because that's where the Aztecs started. According to their origin story, cacao wasn't something humans discovered on their own. It was stolen from paradise by a god. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, one of the most important deities in the Aztec pantheon, descended from the heavens, carrying a cacao tree that belonged to the divine realm. He gave it to humanity as a gift. The other gods were furious. Cacao was never meant to leave paradise. For his crime, Quetzalcoatl was banished, cast out by the gods he had betrayed, supposedly vowing to return one day to reclaim what was his. That myth did a lot of heavy lifting in Aztec culture. It established cacao as something that didn't belong in the human world, a stolen treasure, a divine substance that mortals possessed only because a god broke the rules to give it to them. Drinking cacao wasn't just pleasurable or prestigious. It was, in a very literal sense, consuming something that belonged to heaven. The Aztec version of the drink itself was called xocolotl, sometimes written chocolatl, and yes, that's where the word chocolate eventually comes from. Like the Maya version, it was made from ground cacao, mixed with water, spiced with chili and vanilla, sometimes thickened with cornmeal. Unlike what most people expect, it was typically served cold. No sugar, no milk. Nothing sweet about it. Bitter, spicy, thick, and deeply unfamiliar to anyone raised on the modern version. Only the elite drank it. Warriors, priests, nobility, and the merchant class. The Pochteca, who controlled long-distance trade routes, had access to xocolotl. Ordinary citizens of the Aztec Empire did not. Drinking cacao in public was a visible, unmistakable declaration of status. You didn't just enjoy it, you performed it. Nobody performed it more aggressively than the emperor. According to the Spanish soldier and chronicler Bernal Diaz del Castillo, Emperor Montezuma drank as many as 50 cups of xocolotl per day. 50. Served in golden goblets. And here's the detail that always gets me. The goblets were thrown away after a single use. Not washed, not recycled, discarded. Every cup, every time. Now there's a reasonable chance that the 50-cup number is inflated. Diaz del Castillo was writing from memory, years after the fact, and Spanish chroniclers weren't exactly known for understatement when describing the civilizations they were busy dismantling. But the core of the account, that Montezuma consumed enormous quantities of cacao from vessels that were deliberately disposed of, is corroborated across multiple Spanish sources. The excessiveness wasn't accidental, it was the point. In a society where cacao was precious, conspicuously wasting it was the ultimate power move. This is the same man, by the way, who reportedly kept a treasury containing around 960 million cacao beans, nearly 1 billion, stockpiled in the imperial warehouses of Tenochtitlan, a city of roughly 200,000 people, larger than any city in Europe at the time, built on an island in the middle of a lake. Those beans weren't sitting there for decoration. They were the empire's operating budget. Because here's the thing that separates the Aztec relationship with cacao from every civilization that came before. They formalized it as currency. Not loosely, not informally, systematically. Cacao beans had fixed exchange rates in the markets of Tenochtitlan, surviving records from Spanish friars who documented Aztec life, particularly Bernardino de Sahagún, whose Florentine Codex is the most detailed account we have. Give us actual prices. A tamale from a street stall, 1 cacao bean. A small rabbit, 30 beans. A turkey egg, 3 beans. A full-grown turkey, 200 beans. A good quality slave, roughly 100 beans. Let that last one sit for a second. 100 cacao beans could purchase a human being. The same raw material that you can currently buy in bulk at a health food store, probably for about $12, was once the unit of measure for human lives. The same substance your kid gets for Halloween, the same thing melting in a glove box somewhere right now, once carried the weight of a person's entire existence, reduced to a transaction. That's not a metaphor. That's an economy. The system ran on tribute. As the Aztec Empire expanded through military conquest, subjugated city-states were required to pay regular tribute to Tenochtitlan, and cacao was among the most demanded items on the tribute rolls. Some provinces owed thousands of loads of cacao beans every year. The flow of cacao from conquered lowland territories into the highland capital was constant, massive, and non-negotiable, which points to something crucial about why cacao held such extraordinary value in the first place. Tenochtitlan sits at roughly 2,200 meters above sea level. The climate there is temperate, dry, and completely unsuitable for growing cacao trees, which need tropical lowland heat and humidity to survive. The Aztecs couldn't grow a single bean in their own capital. Every pod, every bean, every cup of chocolate that Montezuma drank had to be imported from distant conquered territories, hundreds of kilometers to the south and east. The scarcity was structural and self-reinforcing. The more the empire depended on cacao as currency, the more it needed to conquer the regions where cacao grew. The more it conquered, the more tribute flowed in. The more tribute flowed in, the more entrenched cacao became in the economic system. Demand never stopped growing, but supply was always limited by geography and climate. Cacao also served a military function that doesn't get mentioned enough. Aztec warriors carried cacao paste, ground beans pressed into dense, portable tablets, as a field ration during campaigns. It was compact, calorie-dense, shelf-stable, and the theobromine content provided a mild but sustained boost in alertness and energy. In the loosest possible sense, these tablets were history's first chocolate bars. Not sweet, not smooth, nothing like what you'd recognize, but functionally serving the same purpose that chocolate rations would serve in military kits thousands of years later. Here's the detail that really makes cacao feel real as a currency, though, more real than any price list or tribute record. People counterfeited it. Merchants in Aztec markets would carefully hollow out cacao beans, remove the valuable interior, fill the empty shells with mud or avocado pits, and reseal them so they looked genuine from the outside. They'd mix these fakes in with real beans and try to pass them off in transactions. The craftsmanship involved was apparently sophisticated enough that it wasn't always easy to detect. The punishment for getting caught was death. Not a fine, not imprisonment, execution for faking a bean. That tells you more about how seriously this civilization took cacao than any mythology or price list ever could. When people risk their lives to counterfeit something, that something is money. Real money. The kind that makes an economy run, that people will cheat and die for, that holds a society together through shared belief in its value. There's a pattern here that shows up across almost every civilization in human history. When you take something that is divine in origin, structurally scarce because of geography, and pharmacologically active, in a way that makes people feel genuinely different after consuming it, humans will, without exception, turn that thing into a currency. Cacao checked every single box. It was stolen from paradise by a god. It couldn't be grown, where the people who wanted it most actually lived. And it contained a compound that quietly, reliably altered mood and sharpened focus every time someone consumed it. For over 200 years, the Aztec Empire ran on this system. Cacao as God, cacao as money, cacao as power, all wrapped up in one small, dark, bitter bean. And then, in 1502, a ship appeared off the coast of Central America. The man aboard had spent his career convinced he was going to change the world. He was handed a bag of cacao beans by a Maya trading crew, and he had absolutely no idea what he was looking at. For over 200 years, the Aztec system ran like clockwork, nearly 1 billion cacao beans in the imperial treasury, a tribute network stretching across hundreds of kilometers, an emperor consuming 50 golden goblets a day and discarding each one without blinking, warriors marching into battle with cacao paste tablets strapped to their belts, merchants risking execution just to counterfeit a bean. It was, by almost any measure, one of the most sophisticated, commodity-based economies the ancient world had ever produced. And then Europe showed up, and the first European to encounter cacao completely missed it. It's 1502. Christopher Columbus is on his fourth and final voyage to the New World, the last swing of a career that had already reshaped the map of the world. His crew intercepts a large Maya trading canoe off the coast of what's now Honduras. The canoe is loaded with goods, cloth, copper bells, obsidian blades, tools, and these strange, dark, almond-shaped beans that the Maya crew are handling with an almost alarming level of care. According to an account later written by Columbus's son Ferdinand, when some of the beans spilled on the deck, the Maya traders scrambled to pick them up, as if, in Ferdinand's words, an eye had fallen from their heads. Columbus's crew gathered up a sample. Columbus brought them back to Spain. They were probably tossed in a storeroom somewhere, briefly examined, and forgotten entirely. Nobody at the Spanish court had any idea what they were. Nobody followed up. Nobody cared. The man who opened the New World to Europe, who had already triggered the most consequential collision of civilizations in human history, was handed the single most commercially significant crop that world had to offer, and he shrugged. It's honestly one of the great missed moments in exploration history. Columbus had it in his hands, literally in his hands. The Maya traders had practically demonstrated, through their own panicked body language, that these beans were extraordinarily valuable. And Columbus logged it, shipped it, and moved on. It would take a very different kind of man to understand what cacao actually was. Not a better man, just a more calculating one. 17 years later, in 1519, Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico with roughly 500 soldiers and a set of ambitions that far outstripped his resources. Within months, he and his men had marched inland to Tenochtitlan, the island capital of the Aztec Empire, a city that by every Spanish account left them speechless. Canals, causeways, towering temples, a market larger than anything in Europe. Cortes himself wrote to King Charles V that the city was so extraordinary he could barely trust his own eyes. Montezuma received Cortes and his men. The full picture of why he did this is complicated and still debated by historians. And during that encounter, the Spanish were served xocolotl, the bitter, cold, spiced cacao drink that the Aztec elite had been consuming for centuries. The Spanish hated it, almost universally. One early account, and the exact attribution is contested, described it as a bitter drink, more fit for pigs than for people, which, honestly, is a pretty understandable reaction if you've never tasted anything like raw, unsweetened, chili-spiked cacao before. But here's the difference between Columbus and Cortes. Columbus saw strange beans and saw strange beans. Cortes saw xocolotl being served in golden vessels by an emperor. He watched those beans change hands at a specific, consistent rate of exchange in the largest marketplace he'd ever seen. He observed an economy running on cacao, a full monetary system, complete with pricing structures, tribute networks, and warehouses containing close to 1 billion units of currency. Cortes didn't need to like chocolate. He didn't need to understand the taste. He just needed to understand what it was worth. And that he grasped immediately. What followed was not subtle. Between 1519 and 1521, Cortes and his forces, augmented by tens of thousands of indigenous allies, besieged and ultimately destroyed Tenochtitlan. The city was razed. The population was devastated by violence, starvation, and smallpox. The empire collapsed, and in the wreckage, the Spanish seized what remained, including the cacao treasury and the tribute infrastructure that had kept it flowing. The tribute system didn't end. It was redirected. Where cacao once flowed to Montezuma, it now flowed to Spain. But there was still a problem. Europeans didn't like the taste. If cacao was going to matter, something had to change. The change was sugar. Sometime in the 1520s to 1540s. The exact date is unclear, and it may have happened gradually, rather than in a single moment. Spanish monks and colonists in the New World began experimenting with adding cane sugar to cacao drinks. Sugar was already being produced in Spanish colonies, so it was available. The combination transformed the experience completely. The bitterness softened, the flavour opened up, the chili and vanilla that had always been present suddenly had a sweeter context to work within. That single addition, sugar to cacao, is arguably the most consequential recipe change in the history of food. Without it, chocolate stays a regional Mesoamerican drink that Europeans find undrinkable. The story ends in the 1520s. A historical footnote, a strange New World beverage that never caught on. With it, chocolate becomes the product the world would spend the next 5 centuries fighting over. The Spanish recognized what they had almost immediately. Cacao sweetened with sugar wasn't just tolerable, it was addictive. It was stimulating. It was unlike anything available in Europe, and it could only be sourced from Spanish colonial territories. Spain now controlled the supply of the most desirable new product to enter the European market in centuries: the cacao plantations, the sugar plantations, the shipping routes, the recipes, the knowledge. All of it was theirs, and for almost 100 years they would do everything in their power to make sure it stayed that way. Spain had the recipe, Spain had the plantations, Spain had the trade routes, the colonial infrastructure, and the only people in Europe who actually knew how to turn raw cacao beans into something worth drinking. For roughly a century, from the 1520s through the early 1600s, they managed to keep all of it to themselves. Think about that for a second. In an era of constant espionage between European powers, when kings routinely paid spies to steal each other's military secrets and trade advantages, Spain successfully hid the most addictive new product on the continent for almost 100 years. No other European country knew what chocolate was, how to make it, or why the Spanish seemed so obsessed with importing these strange dark beans from the New World in enormous quantities. The secrecy wasn't accidental, it was enforced. Jesuit priests and Spanish monks who had learned chocolate preparation techniques in New World missions were expected to keep that knowledge within Spanish networks. Cacao imports flowed through controlled trade routes, managed at the royal level. The product moved from colonial plantations to Spanish ports to Spanish kitchens, and at no point in that chain was there an obvious place for an outsider to intercept the knowledge and figure out what to do with it. For 100 years, Spain sat on what was arguably the most valuable food secret in the world, and honestly, that's kind of impressive, in a ruthless colonial monopoly kind of way. But here's the problem with secrets. Eventually, somebody talks. Or more accurately, somebody marries. The first cracks appeared around 1606, when a Florentine merchant named Antonio Carletti, who had travelled extensively through Spanish colonial territories, reportedly brought knowledge of chocolate preparation back to Italy. The details are a little fuzzy at that distance, but Carletti is sometimes cited as the first vector through which chocolate knowledge escaped the Spanish sphere. The real breach, though, came in 1615. King Philip III of Spain arranged a marriage between his daughter, Anne of Austria, and despite the title, she was Spanish, not Austrian, and the young French king Louis XVI. It was a standard diplomatic marriage designed to strengthen ties between two powerful Catholic monarchies. What Philip probably didn't account for was that his daughter was bringing her chocolate habit with her. Annie arrived at the French court with her own personal attendant, a woman known as La Melina, whose job, among other things, was to prepare the princess's chocolate. The French court tasted it, and within what seems to have been an almost embarrassingly short period of time, Versailles lost its collective mind over the stuff. By the time Louis XVI took the throne, chocolate had become a full institution at the French court, consumed daily, served at official functions, discussed with the kind of obsessive enthusiasm that the French usually reserve for wine. A princess smuggling her addiction into a foreign country inside a royal marriage. That's essentially what happened. One of the most consequential leaks in culinary history delivered in a wedding procession. From France, the spread accelerated. Chocolate reached England by the 1650s. The first London chocolate house opened in 1657 on Bishopsgate Street, and it was run, tellingly, by a Frenchman. The knowledge chain from Spain to Italy to France to England is practically visible in the nationalities of the people operating at each step. Within a single generation, Spain's century-long monopoly was effectively over. The secret was out across Western Europe, and the question was no longer whether other countries wanted chocolate. They absolutely did. The question was what to do about the fact that they wanted it very, very badly. One thing they needed to sort out first, though, and this is one of my favourite details in the entire story, was whether drinking chocolate was a sin. The Catholic Church had a genuine multi-decade theological debate over a single question: is chocolate a food or a drink? The distinction mattered enormously, because if chocolate was classified as a food, then consuming it would break the Lenten fast. Catholics across Europe and the New World were forbidden from eating solid food during fasting periods. Drinking, however, was permitted. So, was chocolate a liquid you drank, or was it food disguised as a liquid? The Church in Rome and the Church in the New World gave contradictory rulings. Theologians argued about it in writing. Different orders of monks took different positions. The debate dragged on for decades, which tells you something remarkable about how seriously chocolate was being taken by this point. This wasn't a casual conversation. Cardinals and bishops were formally debating the spiritual implications of hot chocolate. The resolution, attributed to Pope Alexander VI around 1662, was elegant in its simplicity. Liquids do not break the fast. Chocolate was a liquid. Therefore, chocolate was fine. Millions of Catholic chocolate drinkers across Europe exhaled. The Church had essentially given chocolate its blessing, which meant demand, already growing fast, was about to accelerate even further. There was another engine driving adoption among the European elite. That's easy to overlook from a modern perspective. Chocolate wasn't just marketed as a pleasure, it was marketed as medicine. European physicians in the 17th century prescribed chocolate for an astonishing range of conditions: melancholy, digestive disorders, fever, weakness of the stomach, general fatigue. Some promoted it as an aphrodisiac. The medical framing gave aristocrats and intellectuals something they badly needed: permission. Because here's the uncomfortable subtext. European elites of this era weren't entirely comfortable embracing a drink that originated from indigenous cultures they considered inferior. Framing chocolate as medicinal, as something your physician recommended for your health, made it intellectually respectable. You weren't indulging in an exotic foreign habit. You were following medical advice. That framing cleared the last psychological barrier to mass elite adoption. By the mid-1600s, chocolate was spreading through the courts, salons, and private homes of the European aristocracy at a pace that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Demand was surging. Supply was still controlled by colonial plantations thousands of miles away, and every cup required 2 ingredients, grown exclusively in tropical climates on the other side of the Atlantic: cacao and sugar, which created a problem, a massive structural unavoidable problem, because getting enough cacao and sugar to satisfy a continent's rapidly growing obsession required labour, enormous quantities of labour, in brutal tropical conditions, at a scale that no existing workforce could provide. The solution that colonial powers arrived at would cost millions of people their freedom, and it would define the economics of chocolate for the next 300 years. The Spanish secret was out, the French court was obsessed, the church had given its blessing, and physicians were prescribing it for basically everything short of a broken leg. By the middle of the 17th century, the question wasn't whether Europeans wanted chocolate. That was settled. The question was what kind of social world chocolate was going to create once it arrived. In England, the answer turned out to be something nobody could have predicted. The first London chocolate house opened in 1657 on Bishopsgate Street. Within a few decades, chocolate houses had spread across the city, concentrated in the same neighbourhoods as coffee houses and taverns, competing for the same clientele of wealthy, politically connected, overwhelmingly male Londoners who had money to spend and opinions to share. But chocolate houses weren't cafes. That's the wrong mental image entirely. They weren't places you popped into for a quiet drink and a pastry. They were, depending on which one you walked into, something closer to a political headquarters, a private intelligence network, a gambling den, or all three operating simultaneously under one roof. Each major chocolate house had a political identity, and everyone in London's elite circles knew which was which. The Cocoa Tree, on St. James's Street, was a Tory stronghold, the place where conservative, royalist-leaning politicians and their allies gathered, argued strategy, and exchanged information that wouldn't appear in any public record. Other establishments leaned Whig. The political coding was so consistent that your choice of chocolate house was, in itself, a public declaration of allegiance. Walking through the door told people which side you were on before you opened your mouth. There was even a beverage split that tracked along party lines. Whigs, broadly speaking, drank coffee. Tories drank chocolate. The drinks themselves had become political signifiers, which sounds absurd until you remember that humans have been encoding tribal identity into consumption choices. For as long as there have been humans, we do the same thing today with different products. The mechanism hasn't changed. Only the drinks have. The most famous of all the chocolate houses, and the one that tells you the most about what this culture actually looked like from the inside, was White's. White's Chocolate House opened in 1693, founded by an Italian immigrant named Francesco Bianco, whose name was anglicised to Francis White. It started as a place to drink chocolate. It evolved, rapidly, into something else entirely. By the early 1700s, White's had become the social epicentre of London's aristocratic elite, a place where fortunes were wagered, political deals were brokered, and the boundary between entertainment and recklessness was treated as a suggestion rather than a rule. Here's the detail that always gets me. White's was legendary for its gambling, and not the dignified, restrained kind. Members bet on absolutely anything. There are accounts of men wagering on which of two raindrops would reach the bottom of a window pane first, on whether a particular ship would arrive on a specific date, on the outcome of wars they had no involvement in, the betting book at White's, which was a real, physical ledger where wagers were recorded, became one of the most fascinating social documents of the 18th century. The story that captures the atmosphere best, though, is this one. Around 1750, a man collapsed on the pavement directly outside White's front door. He may have been having a medical episode. The accounts vary. Inside the club, members immediately began placing bets on whether the man was dead or merely unconscious. When someone suggested they should perhaps bring him inside and attempt to help, objections were raised, on the grounds that intervening might affect the outcome of the wagers. Side bets were then placed on whether revival attempts, if undertaken, would succeed. The man survived, incidentally, which apparently caused significant financial inconvenience to several gentlemen inside the establishment. That's the World Chocolate built in London. Not romantic, not sweet, not anything resembling the Valentine's Day associations we have today. This was a masculine, competitive, politically charged, occasionally sociopathic social arena where chocolate was the entry ticket and the atmosphere was closer to a high-stakes trading floor than a cosy cafe. White's, by the way, is still open. It transitioned from chocolate house to private gentleman's club in the 18th century, and it has operated continuously ever since. It is currently the oldest and most exclusive gentleman's club in the world. Membership is by invitation only. The waiting list is measured in decades, and for most of its history it has counted prime ministers, royals, and the upper reaches of British aristocracy among its members. Prince Charles, now King Charles III, was a member. All of that started with chocolate. A chocolate house in 1693. There's one other detail about the chocolate house era in England that matters enormously, and it's easy to miss if you're not looking for it. Women were banned from entering. Completely. Without exception. Chocolate houses were male-only spaces. Not informally, not by soft social convention, but by explicit policy. Despite the romantic, feminine associations that chocolate would later acquire, in its first major European social incarnation, chocolate culture was aggressively, deliberately masculine. Women could not enter the buildings where chocolate was consumed, could not participate in the political conversations that happened there, and could not access the social networks that formed inside those rooms. This wasn't a minor cultural footnote. It had real consequences. The political deals made in chocolate houses excluded women entirely. The financial wagers placed there were made with family money that wives had no say in spending. The hours that men spent inside these establishments were hours they weren't spending at home, which is how we get to one of the earliest documented consumer complaints in history. In 1674, a pamphlet appeared in London titled "The Women's Petition Against Coffee." Despite the name, it targeted both coffee houses and chocolate houses, and its complaint was pointed. Women were fed up. Their husbands were spending excessive time and money in these establishments, neglecting their families, their businesses, and the petition was quite specific about this, their marital duties. The pamphlet argued that the beverages served in these houses were making men useless at home in multiple respects. Now, Historians have debated how seriously to take this document. Some consider it genuine political protest. Others think it was at least partly satirical, a send-up of the coffee house and chocolate house culture written to provoke rather than to formally petition. The truth is probably somewhere between those two readings. What's beyond debate is that the underlying complaint was real. Chocolate houses were absorbing the time, money, and attention of London's upper-class men on a scale that had measurable social consequences. Whether the women's petition was entirely earnest or partly tongue-in-cheek, the grievance it described was genuine. Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Cross the English Channel, and you land in a completely different chocolate culture. In France, chocolate didn't become a masculine, political, public institution. It went in almost exactly the opposite direction. French chocolate culture developed in private salons, intimate settings, and aristocratic homes. And crucially, women were not only included, they were central to it. Among the French aristocracy, chocolate became associated with feminine pleasure, private indulgence, sensuality, and eroticism. It was something a woman consumed in her private chambers in the morning, often in bed, often alone or with close companions. The imagery around chocolate in French art and literature from this period is strikingly intimate, warm, soft, personal, unhurried. Nobody embodied this more vividly than the Marquise de Sévigné, Marie de Rabutin-Chantal, one of the most celebrated letter writers in French literary history. Sévigné was obsessed with chocolate, and her letters to her daughter contain some of the most detailed, personal, and occasionally contradictory accounts of chocolate consumption from this era. She swung between wild enthusiasm and anxious suspicion, at one point crediting chocolate with curing her ailments, and at another blaming it for various health complaints. Her relationship with the drink reads less like a consumer preference and more like the kind of complicated attachment people usually reserve for other people. What Sévigné's letters capture, and what French chocolate culture more broadly reflected, was chocolate as an emotional, physical, private experience, not political, not public, not competitive, intimate. The contrast with England could not be sharper. Same product, same century, same continent, completely opposite social meanings. In England, chocolate was public, male, political, and performative. In France, chocolate was private, female, sensual, and personal. That split matters far more than it might seem, because it never fully resolved. It just went underground, and resurfaced centuries later in the way chocolate is marketed to this day. Every Valentine's Day chocolate box, every advertisement showing a woman slowly savouring a piece of dark chocolate in soft lighting with her eyes half closed, every marketing campaign that frames chocolate as an intimate indulgence, a private pleasure, a treat you deserve. That's the French tradition. The feminine, erotic, personal framing that developed in Parisian salons in the 1600s is the direct ancestor of how chocolate companies sell their product to you right now in the 21st century. Meanwhile, the masculine, competitive, clubhouse energy of the English chocolate houses didn't disappear either. It just migrated into different forms, into the corporate branding, the business deals, the institutional power structures that would eventually build the modern chocolate industry. 2 chocolate cultures, 2 gender frameworks, both still shaping what chocolate means to us, more than 300 years later. But while all of this was happening, while London gentlemen were betting on dying strangers and French aristocrats were sipping chocolate in silk bedsheets, something else was going on. Something that nobody in those chocolate houses or salons had any reason to think about and every reason to ignore. Because the chocolate in those cups didn't appear by magic. The cacao didn't harvest itself. The sugar didn't refine itself. Every sip required labour. Enormous, brutal, unrelenting labour, performed by people who would never taste what they produced, on plantations thousands of miles away, in conditions that would define the word exploitation for centuries to come. A very different chocolate story was being written, one that had nothing to do with politics or pleasure, and everything to do with price. Every cup of chocolate consumed in a London chocolate house or a Parisian salon required 2 things to exist: cacao and sugar. Both grew exclusively in tropical climates, thousands of miles from the people drinking them. Both required enormous amounts of labour to cultivate, harvest, and process. And by the mid-17th century, demand for both was growing faster than any existing workforce could sustain. That gap between what Europe wanted and what could reasonably be produced is where the story turns. And it doesn't turn gently. When the Spanish first established cacao plantations in the New World, the labour came from indigenous populations. The systems had names. The encomienda, the meter, but the mechanisms were essentially the same. Indigenous people were forced to work colonial land under conditions that ranged from exploitative to lethal. They had no meaningful choice. The legal frameworks varied by region and decade, but the practical reality was consistent. Forced labour, extracted at scale, under threat. What made this system unsustainable wasn't a change of heart. It was biology. European contact brought diseases: smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, against which indigenous populations had no immunity. The mortality was staggering. In some regions of the Americas, an estimated 90% of the indigenous population died within a century of first European contact. Entire communities collapsed. Entire labour systems collapsed with them. The colonial response to this catastrophe was not to reduce demand. It was to find new labour. Beginning in the 16th century and accelerating through the 17th and 18th, colonial powers, Spanish, Portuguese, British, Dutch, French, turned to the transatlantic slave trade. Africans were forcibly captured, transported across the Atlantic in conditions that are difficult to describe without understating their brutality, and put to work on plantations throughout the Caribbean, Central America, South America, and the islands off the West African coast. The scale is almost impossible to hold in your mind. According to the Slave Voyages database, the most comprehensive academic dataset on the transatlantic slave trade, approximately 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported to the New World between the 15th and 19th centuries. Not all of them worked in cacao or sugar. Many worked in cotton, tobacco, rice, and other colonial commodities. But a significant and well-documented portion of that forced labour went directly into the two industries that made European chocolate possible. This is the structural insight that most chocolate histories either skip entirely or mention in passing, and it's the single most important connection in this entire story. You cannot separate the chocolate industry from the sugar industry. They are one system. European-style chocolate does not exist without sugar. The bitter Aztec drink that the Spanish initially hated became a continent-wide obsession specifically because someone added cane sugar to it. That transformation, the one we talked about earlier, the recipe change that unlocked global appetite, required a second crop, grown on a second set of plantations, harvested by a second forced labour pool. Every cup of sweetened chocolate that a European aristocrat lifted to their lips was the convergence point of two supply chains, both running on enslaved labour, from two different continents. The cacao came from plantations in places like Trinidad, Jamaica, Venezuela, and later Brazil and the Portuguese island of São Tomé off the West African coast. The sugar came from Caribbean plantations. Jamaica again, Barbados, Haiti, Cuba, that were among the most brutal labour environments in human history. Workers on sugar plantations had some of the shortest life expectancies of any enslaved population anywhere. The work was dangerous, the conditions were extreme, and the death rate was so high that plantations required a constant influx of new enslaved people just to maintain their workforce. 2 crops, 2 sets of plantations, 2 labour forces of enslaved human beings, both converging in a single cup of hot chocolate, served in a golden vessel, in a room where men bet on whether strangers were alive or dead. Nobody in those rooms was thinking about that. The distance between consumption and production, geographic, social, psychological, was enormous by design. The entire colonial economic model depended on consumers never seeing, never knowing, and never asking where their luxuries came from. Now, here's where the story gets genuinely complicated. Not both sides complicated, structurally complicated, in a way that doesn't let anyone off the hook, but also doesn't allow for the simple version where there are clear villains and clear heroes. The 3 most famous chocolate companies in British history, Cadbury, Fry's, and Rowntree's, were all founded by Quakers, the Society of Friends, devout religious pacifists who were among the earliest and most vocal opponents of slavery in Britain. Quakers were at the forefront of the abolitionist movement. They organised petitions, published pamphlets, refused to consume sugar produced by enslaved labour, and actively campaigned for the end of the transatlantic slave trade. They also promoted chocolate as a wholesome, morally superior alternative to alcohol, which, in an era of devastating gin addiction among the working poor, was a genuinely compassionate position. Chocolate was nourishing. Chocolate was stimulating without being intoxicating. Chocolate, in the Quaker framing, was good. The problem was that the supply chain feeding their chocolate businesses had been shaped by centuries of enslaved labour. The cacao they purchased came from regions where forced labour was either ongoing or had only recently ended. The sugar they used came from the same plantation systems the Quakers themselves were campaigning against. They were caught inside a structure that their own ethics told them was wrong, but that their businesses depended on to function. When Britain abolished slavery across its colonies in 1833, companies like Cadbury faced real disruption. Supply chains had to be rerouted. New sourcing relationships had to be built. The transition was neither instant nor clean, but at least, in theory, the worst was over. Except it wasn't. Around 1900, nearly 70 years after British abolition, Cadbury began receiving reports that their primary cacao supplier, the Portuguese island of São Tomé off the west coast of Africa, was using labour conditions that were functionally indistinguishable from slavery. Workers were being recruited from the African mainland under contracts they didn't understand, transported to the island, and held in conditions from which they had no realistic means of leaving. The pay, if it existed at all, was negligible. The work was brutal. The system was, in every meaningful sense, slavery by another name. William Cadbury, a member of the founding family and a committed Quaker, launched an investigation. He sent a researcher named Joseph Burt to São Tomé to document conditions firsthand. Burt's report, published in 1908 under the title Cocoa and Labour, confirmed what the initial reports had suggested. The labour system on São Tomé was exploitative to a degree that could not be explained away or negotiated around. The investigation took 7 years from first reports to published findings. During that time, Cadbury continued purchasing São Tomé cacao, a decision that drew significant public criticism. Were they waiting for proof before acting? Were they protecting their supply chain for as long as possible? The answer is probably some uncomfortable combination of both. Eventually, Cadbury switched suppliers. A public boycott of São Tomé cacao followed. The scandal became the first major consumer ethics crisis in the chocolate industry. It would not be the last. What São Tomé revealed, and what nobody fully reckoned with at the time, was that the fundamental economics of chocolate hadn't actually changed with abolition. The demand for cheap cacao was still enormous. The profits were still concentrated among processors and retailers in wealthy countries. The labour was still being performed in tropical regions with weak labour protections and limited political power. The legal category of the work had changed. The lived experience of the workers, in many cases, had not. The names changed. The continent changed. The legal language changed. But the fundamental equation, cheap labour producing expensive chocolate for wealthy consumers an ocean away, that equation held. Through the 16th century and the 17th, through abolition and industrialization, through the rise of brands and the birth of advertising. It held in 1521, when Cortés seized the Aztec cacao treasury. It held in 1833, when Britain freed its colonial slaves. It held in 1900, when Cadbury investigated São Tomé, and as we'll see, it still holds today. But before we get there, something else was about to happen. Something that would take chocolate from the drawing rooms of the wealthy and put it for the first time in 5,000 years, into the hands of ordinary people. The age of the chocolate bar was about to begin, and it started with a Dutchman, a hydraulic press, and one of the most underrated inventions in food history. For 5,000 years, chocolate had belonged to the elite, sacred drink in Maya courts, imperial currency in Aztec treasuries, state secret in Spanish palaces, status symbol in London chocolate houses, political tool, religious ritual, aristocratic indulgence. Always exclusive, always expensive, always reserved for the people at the top. The 19th century broke that pattern in about 50 years, and it started with a machine that nobody outside the food industry has ever heard of. In 1828, a Dutch chemist named Coenraad van Houten built a hydraulic press that could do something no one had managed before. Squeeze raw chocolate liquor, the thick, fatty paste you get from grinding processed cacao beans, and separate it into two distinct components. On one side, you got cocoa butter, the natural fat in cacao, which is solid at room temperature. On the other side, you got a dry, fine powder, cocoa powder. That sounds like a minor technical achievement. It was not. Van Houten also developed a process for treating the cocoa powder with alkaline salts, what's now called the Dutch process, which made it milder, darker, and easier to mix with liquid. That alone would have been a significant contribution to food science. But the real revolution was in the separation itself. Because once you had cocoa butter isolated as its own ingredient, you could recombine it with cocoa powder and sugar in precise ratios. You could control the texture. You could pour the mixture into a mold. You could make solid chocolate. Before Van Houten's press, chocolate was a drink. It had been a drink for its entire 5,000-year existence. Every civilization that touched cacao, Olmec, Maya, Aztec, Spanish, French, English, consumed it as a liquid. The idea of eating chocolate as a solid object simply didn't exist. Van Houten's machine made it physically possible for the first time. Every chocolate bar, every truffle, every bonbon, every Easter egg you've ever encountered traces its existence back to a hydraulic press in the Netherlands in 1828. 19 years later, someone figured out what to do with that possibility. In 1847, in Bristol, England, a company called J.S. Fry and Sons took Van Houten's separated ingredients, cocoa powder, cocoa butter, and sugar, mixed them in the right proportions, poured the result into a mould, and let it set. What they unmoulded was the first solid chocolate bar in history. The object you grab off a shelf without thinking, the thing that sits in checkout aisles and vending machines and Halloween bags. That object is less than 200 years old. The concept of a chocolate bar didn't exist before 1847. For context, the photograph was invented about 8 years earlier. The chocolate bar and the camera are roughly the same age. Fry's bar was a breakthrough, but it was still dark, still somewhat bitter, and still an acquired taste for many consumers. The next step came from Switzerland, and it changed the dominant flavour profile of chocolate worldwide. In 1875, a Swiss chocolatier named Daniel Peter had been struggling for years with a specific problem: how to incorporate milk into solid chocolate. Milk contains water, and water doesn't mix well with cocoa butter. The result tends to be grainy, unstable, and prone to spoilage. Peter couldn't make it work until he partnered with a neighbour who happened to have developed a process for producing condensed milk, a shelf-stable, reduced water milk product. That neighbour was Henry Nestle. Yes, that Nestle. Peter used Nestle's condensed milk to create the first successful milk chocolate. The condensed milk solved the water problem. Most of the moisture had already been removed, and the resulting product was sweeter, creamier, and milder than anything the market had seen. Milk chocolate was an immediate sensation. It was more approachable than dark chocolate, more appealing to a broader palate, and far more suitable for mass consumption. The taste profile that dominates the global chocolate market today. That smooth, sweet, milky flavour that most people picture when they hear the word chocolate begins here, in a Swiss workshop in 1875 with condensed milk and a persistent chocolatier. 4 years later, another Swiss innovator addressed the last remaining problem. Rodolphe Lindt, in 1879, discovered, partly by accident, as some accounts suggest, that agitating liquid chocolate continuously for an extended period transformed its texture dramatically. The process, which he called conching, involved rolling and kneading the chocolate mass for 72 hours or more. Before conching, solid chocolate was gritty, coarse, and slightly unpleasant on the tongue. After conching, it was smooth, glossy, and had that distinctive melt in the mouth quality that we now take for granted. Conching is the reason chocolate feels the way it does in your mouth. That sensation, the slow, even dissolve across your tongue, isn't natural to cacao. It's engineered. Lindt figured out how to make it happen, and the entire industry adopted his technique within a generation. So within roughly 50 years, 1828 to 1879, 4 inventions had fundamentally reinvented chocolate. Van Houten's press made solid chocolate physically possible. Fry's bar proved people would buy it. Peter and Nestlé's milk chocolate made it universally appealing. Lindt's conching made it texturally irresistible. The price followed the technology downward. As production scaled, as processes became standardized, as factories replaced workshops, the cost of chocolate dropped dramatically. For the first time in 5,000 years, for the first time since someone cracked open a cacao pod in an Ecuadorian jungle, ordinary people could afford chocolate. Not aristocrats, not warriors, not priests or emperors, regular people, working class families, children. Chocolate had been democratized. And then America got involved. Milton Hershey wasn't a food scientist. He wasn't an inventor in the Van Houten or Lindt sense. What Hershey was, more than anything, was a systems thinker. Someone who looked at the Swiss and English chocolate innovations and asked, not how do I make it better, but how do I make it bigger? Hershey built a factory in rural Pennsylvania, surrounded it with an entire planned community. Hershey, Pennsylvania, complete with housing, schools, and an amusement park, and focused obsessively on standardization. Same recipe, same process, same product, every single time, at a price point that undercut everyone else in the market. The Hershey bar wasn't the best chocolate in the world. It wasn't trying to be. It was trying to be the most available chocolate in the world. And it succeeded. There's a specific detail about Hershey's chocolate that reveals something fascinating about how market dominance shapes human perception. Hershey's has a distinctive flavour, slightly tangy, faintly sour, with a quality that people who grew up eating European chocolate often describe as unusual or even unpleasant. That flavour comes from butyric acid, a compound produced during Hershey's early milk processing method. The milk underwent a form of controlled lipolysis, partial breakdown of milk fats, that generated butyric acid as a byproduct. This wasn't intentional. Hershey wasn't trying to create that flavour. It was an artifact of his production process, a technical limitation that he either didn't notice, didn't mind, or couldn't cost-effectively fix at scale. But here's the thing. Hershey's became so dominant in the American market, so ubiquitous for so many decades, that the butyric acid tang stopped being perceived as a flaw. It became the definition. Americans who grew up eating Hershey's don't taste the butyric acid as something wrong. They taste it as what chocolate is supposed to taste like. European chocolate, to many American palates, tastes off, too rich, too smooth, missing that familiar edge. One company's production quirk became an entire nation's flavour baseline. That's not quality. That's market power shaping sensory perception over generations. As competition between chocolate companies intensified through the late 1800s and into the 1900s, something else emerged that would reshape the product's identity permanently. Chocolate became one of the first major products of modern consumer advertising. Companies needed to differentiate themselves, and the way they chose to do it tells you everything about which cultural tradition won the battle for chocolate's meaning. Remember the split from earlier: masculine and political in English chocolate houses, feminine and intimate in French salons. Advertising settled the question decisively. The imagery that dominated chocolate marketing from the late 19th century onward was overwhelmingly feminine, romantic, and domestic. Women savouring chocolate in private moments. Chocolate as a gift between lovers. Chocolate as comfort, as indulgence, as emotional reward. The French tradition won. The English tradition faded into the background. Every modern chocolate advertisement you've ever seen, every Valentine's Day campaign, every slow-motion shot of someone breaking a piece of dark chocolate with their eyes closed, is a direct descendant of the culture that developed in Parisian salons 200 years earlier. The marketing playbook was written in the 1600s. The 20th century just scaled it up. By the early 1900s, chocolate had completed a transformation that would have been unimaginable to the Maya priest pouring cacao between vessels or the Aztec emperor discarding golden goblets. It had gone from sacred to political to industrial, from drink to solid, from elite to universal, from temple offering to penny candy. But all of that industrial engineering, the pressing, the conching, the milk processing, the sugar ratios, was optimizing for something that nobody in the 19th century fully understood. Something buried in the chemistry of the cacao bean itself. Something that had been quietly driving human obsession with this plant for 5 millennia. So why do we actually crave this stuff? Not like it. Not enjoy it occasionally. Crave it. That specific, persistent pull that makes chocolate different from almost every other food on the planet. Nobody craves carrots at midnight. Nobody hides in the pantry sneaking rice crackers. Chocolate occupies a category of desire that most foods simply don't reach. And it's been doing that for 5,000 years across every culture that's ever encountered it. There's a reason for that. And it's not just it tastes good. The primary psychoactive compound in cacao is theobromine. It's a methyl xanthine, the same chemical family as caffeine, but it behaves differently in almost every way that matters. Where caffeine hits fast, peaks hard, and fades quickly, theobromine works on a slower curve. The onset is gentler, the effect is milder, but it lasts significantly longer. What you get isn't a jolt. It's more like a quiet, sustained opening, a lift in mood, a sharpening of focus, a subtle warmth that settles in and stays for a while. This is not placebo. This is not chocolate. Makes me feel happy because I associate it with birthdays. This is pharmacology. Theobromine genuinely elevates mood and alertness through measurable biochemical pathways, which means every civilization that ever treated cacao as something more than food was responding to something real. The Maya priests who drank it before rituals weren't imagining the shift in their mental state. The Aztec warriors who carried cacao paste tablets into battle weren't relying on superstition for their energy. Montezuma drinking 50 cups a day wasn't just showing off. The man was, by any modern assessment, a mild theobromine addict. The effects were subtle enough that no ancient culture could have identified the mechanism, but consistent enough that every ancient culture noticed the result. Cacao also contains caffeine, though in smaller amounts than coffee or tea. The two compounds work together. Theobromine providing the sustained baseline, caffeine adding a shorter, sharper edge on top. The combination creates a stimulant profile that's genuinely unique among common foods. Nothing else delivers quite the same blend of gentle, lasting alertness. Now, here's where I want to be honest with you, because some of what you've probably heard about chocolate's brain chemistry is real, and some of it has been significantly oversold. You may have come across the claim that chocolate contains a love chemical, phenylethylamine or P. This is technically true. P is present in chocolate, and it's the same compound your brain produces naturally when you're attracted to someone. The idea that eating chocolate chemically mimics the experience of falling in love has been repeated in magazines, documentaries, and Valentine's Day marketing campaigns for decades. The reality is more complicated. P from food is largely broken down by enzymes in your digestive system before it ever reaches your brain in meaningful quantities. The amount that actually crosses the blood-brain barrier from a chocolate bar is, by most pharmacological assessments, negligible. You're not falling in love when you eat chocolate. Your gut is just metabolizing a compound before it can do much of anything. What P did contribute to, though, was the mythology, the romantic association between chocolate and love, already baked into the culture from centuries of French salon tradition. Got a pseudo-scientific justification that was too poetically perfect for anyone to resist repeating. The love chemical story stuck because people wanted it to be true, not because the biochemistry supported it at meaningful doses. There's another compound in chocolate that gets less attention, but is, scientifically, far more interesting. In 1996, researchers at the Neurosciences Institute in San Diego published a study in Nature, identifying anandamide in chocolate. Anandamide is a lipid neurotransmitter, a molecule your brain produces naturally that binds to the same receptors as THC, the primary psychoactive compound in cannabis. The name itself comes from the Sanskrit word ananda, meaning bliss. Chocolate contains small amounts of anandamide. More importantly, it also contains compounds that inhibit the enzyme responsible for breaking anandamide down. The practical effect is that the anandamide already present in your system lingers a little longer than it otherwise would. The bliss molecule gets a slightly extended window before anyone gets too excited. The amounts involved are small, genuinely small. You would need to eat several kilograms of chocolate in a single sitting to produce anything resembling a psychoactive effect comparable to cannabis. That's not happening, but the mechanism is real. The receptor binding is real. The inhibition of breakdown is real. Chocolate is, at a molecular level, gently nudging the same neural pathways that cannabis activates more aggressively. The fact that cacao naturally contains a compound called bliss that operates on cannabinoid receptors is, at minimum, a remarkable coincidence. At maximum, it's a partial explanation for why humans across every era and geography have responded to this plant with a reverence usually reserved for things that are genuinely psychoactive, because cacao is genuinely psychoactive, just quietly. All of that chemistry, though, still doesn't fully explain the craving, because chocolate's effect on the brain isn't just chemical, it's also physical. And this is the part that honestly surprised me most when I started researching it. Cocoa butter, the fat component that Van Houten's press separated out in 1828, melts at a very specific temperature range, roughly 34 to 38 degrees Celsius. Human body temperature sits at 37 degrees. That overlap is not a coincidence in terms of experience. It's the reason chocolate melts in your mouth. Not slowly, not reluctantly. It melts at precisely the temperature of the inside of your mouth, dissolving across your tongue in a way that triggers a sensory cascade no other common food can replicate. When people describe chocolate as melting in your mouth, they're not using a metaphor. They're describing a physical phenomenon, governed by the specific melting point of a particular fat. Lindt's conching process, the 72 hours of agitation he pioneered in 1879, was specifically designed to maximize this effect. Conching creates an even, uniform crystal structure in the cocoa butter, which makes the melting behavior smoother and more consistent. The texture you feel when high-quality chocolate dissolves on your tongue is an engineered optimization of a natural physical property. 5,000 years of human cacao obsession, and it turns out the plant was carrying a fat that melts at the exact temperature of the human body the entire time. There's one more layer to this, and it comes from modern food science rather than ancient chemistry. In the 20th century, food researchers, most notably a scientist named Howard Moskowitz, developed the concept of the bliss point. The bliss point is the precise combination of sugar, fat, and sensory novelty that most effectively activates the brain's reward circuitry. It's the ratio at which a food becomes not just enjoyable, but compulsive, the point where your brain stops evaluating and starts wanting more. Milk chocolate, as it was developed through the industrial innovations we just covered, hits the bliss point almost perfectly. The sugar content, the fat content from cocoa butter and milk, the smooth melting texture, the mild stimulant effect from theobromine and caffeine. The entire package is, whether by design or by iterative market selection, precisely calibrated to the spot where human reward circuitry lights up most intensely. The journalist Michael Moss, in his book Salt, Sugar, Fat, documented how modern food companies engineer products specifically to reach this threshold. Chocolate didn't need much engineering. It was already close. The industrial innovations of the 19th century just closed the remaining gap. So here's where we land. Chocolate is genuinely, measurably, pharmacologically pleasurable. It contains a real stimulant that elevates mood. It interacts with cannabinoid receptors in your brain. It melts at the exact temperature of your body, and its modern form is engineered to hit the neurological sweet spot, where desire becomes compulsion. The Maya priest pouring cacao between vessels in a darkened temple, watching the sacred foam rise to the surface. He had no vocabulary for any of this, no framework for methylxanthines, or cannabinoid receptors, or bliss points, but he knew something was in that cup, something that changed how he felt, how he thought, how he connected to the world around him. He poured it for the gods, because it felt like something the gods had made. 5,000 years, and a few hundred peer-reviewed studies later, the science confirms what his intuition told him. This plant is extraordinary, which makes what's happening in the chocolate industry right now, what's been happening for decades, largely out of sight, in places most consumers will never visit, all the more morally difficult to sit with, while all of those innovations were transforming chocolate in European and American factories, while Van Houten and Fry and Lindt and Hershey were figuring out how to make it smoother, sweeter, cheaper, and more addictive. The geography of where cacao actually grows was quietly shifting, and that shift changed everything about who pays the real cost of your chocolate bar. For most of history, cacao was grown in the Americas, Central America, South America, the Caribbean. That's where the plant originated, where the Olmec and Maya first cultivated it, where colonial plantations operated for centuries. But through the 20th century, driven by colonial land policies and post-colonial economics, the centre of global cacao production migrated to West Africa, specifically to two countries, Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, and Ghana. Today, those two nations produce roughly 70% of the world's cacao. 7 out of every 10 chocolate bars on the planet start in West African soil. Here's what that looks like from the ground. The average cacao farmer in Ivory Coast earns somewhere between $1 and $2 per day. The global chocolate industry. Those farmers' supply is worth over $130 billion a year. When you buy a chocolate bar for $3, the farmer who grew the cacao in that bar receives approximately 18 cents. That's after the costs of labour, of inputs like fertiliser and tools, of the middlemen who buy the beans at the farm gate and transport them to processing centres. 18 cents out of $3, roughly 6% of the final product's value, reaches the person who actually grew the raw ingredient. 6%. Hold that number. Now consider what happens when a farming family earns $1 to $2 a day and can't afford to hire adult workers at market rates. Consider what happens when the global price of cacao drops, which it does regularly because farmers have almost no power to set prices. And that $1 to $2 becomes 70 cents. Consider what happens in rural communities with minimal access to education, where children are an available labour force, and the economic margin between surviving and not surviving is measured in fractions of a dollar. What happens is child labour, not theoretically, not in isolated cases, systematically. In 2001, this became public enough that the United States Congress got involved. Investigative reporting and advocacy work had exposed the use of child labour, including the worst forms, including trafficking, on cacao farms in West Africa. Congress began drafting legislations that would have required chocolate sold in the US to carry labels indicating whether it was produced using child labour. Slave-free labelling, effectively. The chocolate industry mobilised against mandatory labelling. What emerged instead was a voluntary agreement. The Harkin-Engel Protocol, named after Senator Tom Harkin and Representative Elliot Engel. The major chocolate companies signed on. They committed to eliminating the worst forms of child labour in cacao production. The deadline was 2005. 2005 came. The goal was not met. The deadline was extended to 2008. 2008 came. Not met. Extended to 2010. 2010. Not met. Extended again. In 2020. 19 years after the original protocol, the US Department of Labor funded a comprehensive study by NORC at the University of Chicago to assess progress. The study surveyed cacao-growing regions across Ivory Coast and Ghana, looking specifically at the prevalence of child labour. The findings: approximately 1.56 million children were working in cacao farming in those two countries. Not a decrease from earlier estimates. A 14% increase compared to 2009. After nearly 2 decades of voluntary commitments, the situation had gotten measurably worse. There's a nuance here that's important to acknowledge, because the industry uses it consistently, and it's not entirely wrong. There is a meaningful distinction between child labour, as defined by international standards, and children helping out on a family farm. Kids doing age-appropriate tasks on their own family's land, alongside their parents, outside of school hours, that exists in farming communities worldwide, and is not, by most reasonable definitions, the same as exploitation. The NORC study was aware of this distinction. It accounted for it, and what it found was that a significant number of the children documented in the study were not working on their own families' farms. They were working on farms belonging to other people, in some cases far from their home communities. The study identified patterns consistent with trafficking. Children moved from poorer regions to cacao-growing areas specifically to work. The family farm nuance is real. it does not explain the full picture, not even close. In 2021, the issue reached the United States Supreme Court. In Nestlé USA v. Do, the plaintiffs were former child workers who claimed they had been trafficked from Mali as children and forced to work on cacao farms in Ivory Coast. They sued Nestlé and Cargill, arguing that the company's purchasing practices had aided and abetted the forced labour. The court dismissed the case, but not because it found the companies innocent. The dismissal was on jurisdictional grounds. The court ruled that the alleged harms occurred overseas and that the plaintiffs hadn't sufficiently demonstrated that the corporate decision-making behind those harms took place in the United States. It was a technical ruling about where lawsuits can be filed, not a determination about whether children had been exploited. The distinction matters. That case didn't exonerate anyone. It just closed a legal door. If any of this sounds familiar, if the pattern of discovering exploitation, investigating slowly, and eventually shifting sourcing without fundamentally changing the underlying economics, feels like something we've already covered. There's a reason for that. 120 years earlier, Cadbury discovered that their cacao from São Tomé was being produced under conditions indistinguishable from slavery. They investigated for 7 years, eventually switched suppliers, and the industry moved on. 120 years later, the industry faced the same question it faced in 1900 and gave the same kind of answer: voluntary commitments, extended timelines, incremental adjustments. The names changed, the continent changed, the fundamental equation: cheap labour producing expensive chocolate for distant consumers, held. You might be wondering about the certifications: Fairtrade, Rainforest Alliance, Utes, the labels on the packaging that are supposed to tell you the chocolate was produced ethically. These programs exist, and they're not nothing. Farmers in certified supply chains do, on average, receive somewhat better prices and access to some community development resources. But investigations have repeatedly found significant gaps between what certifications promise and what they deliver on the ground. Auditing is inconsistent. Coverage is incomplete. The price premiums, while real, are often too small to fundamentally change a farmer's economic situation. A farmer earning 6% of the value chain who gets bumped to 8 or 9% through certification is still earning a fraction of what the system extracts from their labour. Certifications create marginal improvement. They do not create systemic change. The difference between those two things is enormous, and it's a difference the marketing tends to blur. The root cause here is not that chocolate companies are uniquely evil. Some have made genuine efforts. Some have invested real money in sustainability programs. The root cause is structural. Cacao is a globally traded commodity. Its price is set on international exchanges by market forces that individual farmers cannot influence. A handful of massive corporations, processors and manufacturers, control the buying side of that market. Farmers scattered across millions of small plots in some of the poorest countries on earth control the selling side. The power imbalance is total. Farmers are price takers in every sense of the word. They sell what they grow at whatever price the market offers, because they have no storage capacity to hold out for better prices, no collective bargaining power to negotiate, and no alternative crop that pays comparably. The system doesn't need villains to produce terrible outcomes. The structure itself generates them. 6%. That's what the people at the very foundation of a $130 billion industry take home. 6%. And out of that 6%, they're supposed to pay for labour, for tools, for fertilizer, for transportation, and somehow not end up in a situation where their children or someone else's children end up working the fields. I'm not going to tell you what to do with that information, but I think you should have it. The question now is, what is the industry actually doing about it? And maybe more importantly, does the structure of the industry even allow for a real solution? 6 companies. That's how many corporations effectively control the global flow of chocolate. Barry Callebaut, Cargill, Olam, Nestlé, Mars, Mondelez. Between them, they dominate the processing, manufacturing, and distribution of chocolate products worldwide. 8 billion people on the planet. 7 million tons of chocolate consumed per year. 6 companies controlling how most of it moves from bean to shelf. That concentration of power doesn't just affect prices and supply chains. It affects something more fundamental than that. It affects what you think chocolate tastes like. Remember the butyric acid detail from earlier. Hershey's distinctive tangy, slightly sour flavour that originated as an accidental byproduct of their early milk processing. That wasn't a deliberate recipe choice. It was a production artifact. But Hershey's became so dominant in the American market for so many decades that the artifact became the standard. Americans who grew up on Hershey's don't register the butyric acid as unusual. They register it as chocolate. The same thing happened in Britain with Cadbury. Cadbury's formula uses a higher sugar ratio than most European regulations would technically allow for products sold as chocolate on the continent. But within the UK, Cadbury's sweetness profile became the definition. British consumers who switch to Swiss or Belgian chocolate often find it too rich or too bitter, not because it is objectively, but because their palate was calibrated to a specific company's product over a lifetime of consumption. This is what market dominance does. When it operates for long enough, it doesn't just sell you a product. It trains your nervous system to accept that product as the baseline. When 6 companies control what most of the world eats, those 6 companies are, functionally, defining what chocolate means, at a sensory level, for entire populations. Over the past 2 decades, a counter-movement has emerged. The craft chocolate boom, bean-to-bar producers, single origin sourcing, high-percentage dark chocolate marketed to consumers who want something more complex and more ethically produced than what the mass market offers. This movement is real, and it represents genuine progress on multiple fronts. Craft producers often pay higher prices to farmers. The flavour profiles they achieve by using better beans, gentler processing, and longer development times are legitimately different from mass-market chocolate at a chemical level. Industrial processing, methods like high-heat roasting, fast conching, and heavy alkalization destroy many of the complex flavour compounds that make great cacao remarkable. Craft chocolate and mass-market chocolate are, in a very real sense, different products made from the same plant. The premium boom deserves credit for that. It has expanded what consumers understand chocolate can be. But it also deserves honest scrutiny. Single origin on a label tells you the beans came from one geographic area. It does not, by itself, tell you anything about the labour conditions on the farms where those beans were grown. Premium pricing at the retail level doesn't automatically translate to premium income at the farm level. The craft segment, for all its growth, still represents a tiny fraction of the total chocolate market, somewhere in the low single digits. The vast majority of the world's chocolate is still mass-produced, mass-distributed, and mass-consumed through the same six-company pipeline. There's also a quieter scandal that most consumers have never heard of. Under EU Directive 2000/36, UEFA, chocolate manufacturers in Europe are permitted to replace up to 5% of a product's cocoa butter with cheaper vegetable fats. Palm oil, shea butter, elaipe fat. 5% might not sound like much, but cocoa butter is the most expensive component of chocolate, and replacing even a small percentage at industrial scale saves enormous amounts of money. To serious chocolate makers and connoisseurs, this is adulteration, replacing the ingredient that gives chocolate its distinctive melting behavior with fats that perform differently on the palate. To the companies doing it, it's cost optimization. Now layer one more problem on top of everything else. The climate problem. Climate scientists project that roughly half of the world's suitable cacao growing land could become unviable by 2050 as rising temperatures and shifting rainfall patterns push growing conditions beyond what cacao trees can tolerate. The plant is remarkably sensitive. It needs consistent temperatures, high humidity, and specific soil conditions that exist in a narrow band around the equator. As that band shifts and shrinks, the regions currently producing 70% of the world's cacao are among the most vulnerable. The companies most exposed to this risk are the largest ones, the same 6 corporations that depend on massive, consistent supply from West Africa. Some are investing in heat-resistant cacao genetics, breeding varieties that can survive in hotter, drier conditions. Others are exploring more radical alternatives. The circle that started in the cold open of this video is beginning to close. The plant that humans spent 5,000 years turning from a jungle tree into a global obsession that survived conquest and colonization and industrialization is now facing something none of those forces threatened: the possibility that the land itself can no longer support it. Which raises a question. The industry can no longer defer. If the current system is unsustainable, economically, ethically, and now environmentally, what replaces it? The chocolate industry is facing 3 crises at the same time. The climate is shrinking the land where cacao can grow. Commodity prices spiked to record highs in 2023 and 2024, sending shock waves through the supply chain. And the ethical problems: child labour, farmer poverty, the 6% value capture, remain fundamentally unresolved after decades of promises. Any one of those would be serious. All 3 converging simultaneously creates something closer to an existential question. Can the current system survive? And if it can't, what replaces it? There are people working on that question right now. Some of what they're doing is genuinely promising. Some of it is still a long way from mattering at scale. The honest answer is that nobody knows yet which of these approaches will work, or whether any of them will work fast enough. Start with the plant itself. Researchers at the USTA and several private companies are actively developing new cacao varieties through selective breeding and genetic modification. Strains designed to tolerate higher temperatures, resist drought, and survive in conditions that would kill current varieties. This is real science producing real results. Heat-resistant cacao genetics exist in laboratories and trial plots today. The problem is time. Developing a new variety, testing it across different environments, scaling it to millions of farms. That's a process measured in decades, not years. The climate timeline and the breeding timeline are not moving at the same speed. A more immediately scalable approach is agroforestry, growing cacao under the canopy of larger trees in mixed crop forest systems, rather than in open monoculture plantations. This is actually closer to how cacao grows naturally in the wild. Shade-grown cacao is more resilient to temperature swings, requires less chemical input, and according to some research, may even produce beans with more complex flavor profiles. Agroforestry works. It's proven. It's available now. It's also dramatically underused because the short-term economics of monoculture, more trees per hectare, faster harvests, still dominate how most farming decisions get made in regions where margins are razor thin. Then there are the approaches that would have sounded like science fiction 20 years ago. In California, a company called California Cultured is growing cacao cells in bioreactors. Not cacao plants. Cacao cells. The process uses cellular agriculture to produce the flavor and fat compounds found in real cacao, without needing a farm, a tropical climate, or any agricultural labor at all. The cells grow in controlled environments. The output is chemically cacao, or at least the components of cacao that matter for flavor and texture. The technology is real. It works in a laboratory setting. Whether it can scale to industrial production at a price point that competes with conventional cacao is a question that hasn't been answered yet. California Cultured's chocolate is not on store shelves today. It may be in 5 years. It may be in 15. It may never reach meaningful market share. The honest assessment is that this is genuinely promising and genuinely unproven. Meanwhile, in Germany, a company called Planet Foods has taken a different approach entirely. Rather than trying to grow cacao without farms, they've asked whether you need cacao at all. Their product is a chocolate analogue, made from oats, sunflower seeds, and other crops that can be grown in temperate European climates. No tropical supply chain, no deforestation pressure, no cacao farming economics whatsoever. Early reviews from food industry professionals have been surprisingly positive. The flavor is not identical to conventional chocolate, but it's close enough that in blind tastings, the gap is narrower than most people expect. Whether consumers will accept chocolate that contains no cacao is a cultural question as much as a technical one. But the fact that the option exists at all represents a genuine shift in what's possible. On the farmer side, there are efforts underway to restructure the economics more directly. Direct trade models cut out layers of middlemen. Farmer cooperatives aggregate bargaining power so that individual growers aren't negotiating alone against global corporations. Blockchain-based traceability systems attempt to create transparent records of where beans come from and what was paid for them at each stage. These approaches help at the margins. Farmers in direct trade relationships do earn more. Cooperatives do shift some power. Traceability does create accountability pressure. But none of these models have yet scaled to the point where they fundamentally alter the structure of a global commodity market. A farmer moving from 6% value capture to 9 or 12% through a cooperative is still earning a fraction of what the downstream industry extracts. The gap narrows. It doesn't close. Which leads to the hardest truth in this section. Individual consumer choices. Buying fair trade, choosing the premium bar, reading the labels, are worth doing. They create small, real improvements in the lives of real farmers. They signal market demand for better practices. They matter, but they cannot, by themselves, fix a structural economic system. The problems in the cacao supply chain are not the result of consumers making bad choices at the checkout line. They are the result of global trade policies, commodity market structures, and power imbalances between producing nations and consuming nations that have been building for centuries. Fixing those problems requires policy, trade agreements, minimum pricing mechanisms, binding labour standards, agricultural investment in producing countries. That's not a consumer problem. That's a governance problem. And it's one the world has been deferring for 50 years. There is no clean ending to this section, because there is no clean ending to this story. The future of chocolate is genuinely uncertain, economically, ethically, environmentally. Anybody who tells you they've got it figured out is either selling something or not paying close enough attention. Which brings us back to where we started, that bar in your hand. You're back in that store. The chocolate bar is still there, right where it always is, between the gum and the phone chargers, next to the register. Still $1.50, maybe $2. Same wrapper, same weight in your hand. Nothing about it has changed. But you've just travelled 5,000 years to get here. You've been in a jungle in Ecuador, where someone cracked open a strange pod and found something extraordinary inside. You've stood in a Maya royal court, watching a priest pour a blood-red drink between sacred vessels, the foam rising to the surface, like an offering to something beyond the room. You've seen an emperor drink 50 golden goblets of that drink in a single day and throw every one of them away. You've watched a man named Columbus hold cacao beans in his hands and not recognize what he was holding. You've watched another man named Cortez recognize it instantly, not because he liked it, but because he understood what it was worth. You've sat in a London chocolate house, where men in powdered wigs bet on whether a stranger on the pavement outside was alive or dead. You've read about 12.5 million people loaded onto ships and transported across an ocean to work the plantations that made your cup of chocolate possible. You've seen the number 1.56 million children. Today, right now, while you're watching this. 6 companies, 6%. None of that changes the chocolate bar in your hand. It's still the same object, still costs the same, still tastes the same. You can still buy it without thinking, and forget about it by the time you get to your car. That's the uncomfortable thing about history. It doesn't change the present. It just changes how clearly you see it. And here's what I keep coming back to. The fact that this thing exists at all. That a bitter seed from an understory tree in the Amazon became one of the most fought over, traded, exploited, celebrated, engineered and craved substances in the entire span of human civilization. That is genuinely extraordinary. The Aztecs called it the food of the gods. Carl Linnaeus agreed. In Latin, in 1753, 5,000 years of science later, the chemistry confirms that they weren't entirely wrong. The story of chocolate is not a comfortable story. It never has been. But it is. Every part of it, including the parts that are hard to sit with, worth knowing. So the next time you pick up that bar at the checkout, maybe just hold it for a second before you open it. Not out of guilt, just out of awareness. 5,000 years of human history got compressed into that wrapper. The least we can do is actually taste it. Like really taste it. Just once. If this video changed how you see something you thought you already knew, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one coming. Thanks you and good night.